Genesis chapter 29. And if you need a Bible, you want to follow along, let's say you forgot your Bible, just raise your hand. We got Bibles you can borrow, or borrows you can Bible, either way, whatever you choose. There's one to my right, Zeke, as well. Keep your hands up nice and high. Genesis chapter 29. Oh, also next Sundays, in my absence, our own worship leader, Bob Durante, is going to guest speak. So come on out. And I need somebody to help. I need somebody to drive the truck here and back home again next week. So, you know, I think anybody who's willing to drive our big truck, maybe Sandy, you want to drive our truck next week? Anyway, you're welcome to do that as long as you have a little experience driving a truck. Genesis chapter 29. Bring us up to speed from last week and weeks prior. We're dealing with Jacob, the son of Isaac, who obviously, because of circumstances we've been studying, is at odds with his twin brother Esau, older by a minute or two. Older by only a minute or two. And the odds, the difficulty that they're struggling with between them was completely unnecessary. Because, you know, God had previously, before they were born, told their mom, Rebekah, that the older would serve the younger, and that God would pass his promises and his inheritance on to the younger. And at this point in chapters 27 and 28, they knew that, and yet they manipulated Isaac, the father, into giving the birthright or the blessing to the younger son when they didn't have to. Because they could have just simply said to themselves, you know what? God said this was going to happen. Let's just sit back and let God work it out. Instead, they conspired, manipulated, and tricked Isaac into giving the blessing. Now, this is how they did it, if you don't remember this story. This is how they did it. They cooked a stew as the kind of a stew that Esau would often cook, because Esau, if you remember, was a hunter. And he would go out and get this wild game, which was not common because they had they had flocks of sheep and cows and so on and so forth, and mainly their food would come from their flocks, and they weren't big on hunting. They were instead they would raise their own cattle. And so this was unusual. So Esau became this hunter, and he would go and he'd get this wild game, and he would cook this special stew, and Isaac really loved this special stew, and he loved his son Esau more so than he loved his son Jacob. While on the other hand, his wife Rebekah loved Jacob more than she loved Esau. And so there was this tension. And God's promise was always intended that the inheritance, which was so important because the whole nation of Israel was going to come through the inheritance, that this person that God had chosen was Jacob and not Esau. God had made that clear. And so now they decided that they were going to trick Isaac into giving the blessing to Jacob when God had already said that he was going to do it. And so they took the hair of goats and they put it on his arms because Esau was a hairy guy. And so they put his clothes on Jacob to make him smell like Esau. And they made the same stew. And the only thing they couldn't do was get Jacob to mimic Esau's voice. And he couldn't do that. And fortunately for them, the plan worked because Isaac's sight was gone. He couldn't see, and so they thought Isaac was about to die. He actually lived another 43 years. But they manipulated Isaac to get the blessing that God had promised. And Jacob's manipulative ways in this chapter 29 are going to come back around, and he will be manipulated by his uncle Laban. Sometimes I've noticed about myself and others who have been, humble and transparent with me, that the only way that we come to recognize sinful things or compromise or character flaws in ourselves is when we're forced into a relationship with someone who's just like us. Did you ever notice that? When we're forced into a relationship and we have to deal with somebody who deals with us the way we deal with others. And it's often things that we hate about others are actually the things we hate about us. We just excuse ourselves or kind of let ourselves off the hook when it comes to those things. But we're quick to find those things in other people, aren't we? When we're involved with somebody else's life and there's something that's offensive to us, man, that's sin, and we see it so clearly. Guess what? The odds are pretty good that that's something that's true about you as well. And I think just as we've seen with Abraham and Isaac, God wants to take Jacob and bring him face to face with his own sin issues. And that's what we see here in chapters 28 and 29 and going forward in Jacob's life as he experiences the consequences. In chapter 28, you remember Jacob on his way up to Haran stops at a place that he later names Bethel, and he has the dream where he sees this vision of a ladder being let down from heaven, angels ascending and descending on it. And now this is a moment that that God reveals himself to Jacob in a way that Jacob had never known before. And now the relationship that Jacob has with God is changing because the mantle has been passed from Isaac to Jacob. And that's something that God does, and God said he would do. They didn't need to manipulate Isaac to get it. And now here's this vision he has. You remember Jesus described this vision as, I am the ladder. The angels descend and ascend through me. And so this is symbolic of our relationship as well that we have with God. A direct relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And Jacob takes 20 years to learn what the consequences of his compromise are, and then lives the rest of his life with some of them, as we're going to see. Verse 1. Chapter 29, Genesis. So Jacob went on his journey, and he came to the land of the people of the east. Now remember, this is somewhere between 500 and 600 miles from the area of Canaan where they previously dwelt. And he looked, in verse 2, and he saw a well in a field. And behold, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it, for out of that well they watered their flocks. A large stone was on the well's mouth. Now all the flocks would be gathered there, and they would roll the stone from the well's mouth, water the sheep, and then they'd put the stone back in its place on the well's mouth. Now keep in mind, in this, as Jacob's traveling here, it's not like what, we have today. What do we have? We have GPS devices hanging on our windshields, right? And then, before that, we had big signs on the roads, and it wasn't difficult. You had maps you could follow, and you could look for certain landmarks and things that were put there specifically to show you where you were. Not so in Jacob's day. Jacob traveled some month to month and a half to cross this 500 to 600 mile area of land, some of it desert, some of it mountainous, probably through Lebanon and the forest of Lebanon and so on and so forth. And he just happens upon the right place and the right people. Coincidence? What do you think? Let's look further. Verse 4. And Jacob said to them, My brethren, where are you from? And they said, We are from Haran, the very place he was looking for. And then he said to them, Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. Now, what's interesting here is they don't expound on we know him, and I some commentators said, and as I studied this a little bit, some suggest, and I'm inclined to agree with them, that it's kind of like, yeah, we know that guy all right. We know, they don't want to say too much more, and then let's see what they go on to say in verse 4 is in verse 6 he says, and so he said to them, Is he well? And it's almost like they're disappointed when they say, He's well. But not a lot of information. It's not like they're saying, oh yeah, we know him really well. And typically this would be like, you're from a far off land, and yeah, we know Laban. How do you know Laban? There's no interaction here. I think we got a glimpse into Laban's character some chapters ago. Remember when Eleazar traveled from the land of Canaan to find a wife for Isaac, and Abraham sent his servant Eleazar, at least we think it was Eleazar, all the way up there, and Isaac's wife Rebekah was found there, and it was Laban's sister. And so this whole thing is coming back around again, and now Laban's going to get another experience where someone from his family is going to be taken from him to marry off into another area or another place. And there's some interesting contrast between that former experience and this one. And we learned about Laban's character as he manipulated back then, and he drew wealth from Abraham through Eleazar. He took all this wealth for himself as a dowry for his sister. And we kind of got a glimpse that his character was one of greed. And so here's these guys. Laban, oh yeah, we know him. Is he well? Uh-huh. And then he says this, look, these guys who are out there around the well, they say, his daughter Rachel is coming with the sheep. So Laban's daughter Rachel is approaching the well at the same time as they're having this conversation. Again, I ask you, coincidence? I don't think so. And then he said, look, it is still high day. This is again Jacob speaking to the men who are gathered around the well. They've brought their 3 flocks are all there, and no one's doing anything. The stone still sits upon the well, and they're all just waiting. Verse 7 says, it is still high day, Jacob speaking. It is not time for the cattle to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go feed them. Interesting. Jacob's like this take charge kind of guy. He's like, what are you guys doing sitting around? How come all your sheep are just laying around here? You guys are standing around jawing, and the stone is still on the well. Are you guys too weak to lift the stone from the well? Later we'll find out that can't be the case because Jacob moves it himself. What do you think's really going on here? Again, there's been lots of speculation, various Bible teachers. You know what I think's going on here? He sees Rachel coming, and here's all these other young guys. He wants to get rid of them, so he's the only guy around, right? Did you ever notice how men will posture when young women pose? Here comes this beautiful young woman, and now he wants to eliminate the competition. At least that's what I'm convinced of. I'm just guessing. I don't know what's really going on here, but I think that's what he's doing. I think he wants to be the only man at the well when this Rachel shows up. But they said, we cannot until the flocks are gathered together and they've rolled the stone from the well's mouth. Then we water the sheep. Now, we don't know why. Apparently, it was the custom of that particular day to wait for, I guess, all the flocks that would typically come to that well to water before they would remove the stone. We don't really know the reason for it. But that was the custom. And now here it is. Jacob's trying to break from tradition and break from the custom. And now while he was still speaking with them, it says in verse 9, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. Interesting. She was a shepherdess. Now, this was not an easy job. This was a difficult job to be a shepherd. It required a lot of really gross things. I mean, you can read A Shepherd's Look at Psalm 23, or I think that's what it's called, right? Shepherd's Look at Psalm 23. And you can learn an awful lot from the eyes of a shepherd what it's like to be a shepherd. And literally, they got to dig their fingers in the sheep's noses to get the bugs out. And I mean, they got to do all these gross things. And sometimes when sheep wander, they literally go out and they'll break a sheep's leg. You've probably heard this, right? The wandering sheep, they'll break its leg, and they'll put the sheep over their shoulders, and they'll carry it around with a broken leg. And the idea there is that the sheep will get the scent of the shepherd and never forget it. You know, the very thing that inflicts the punishment is the one that heals, and so on and so forth, and they become attached to the shepherd. And so being a shepherd is not an easy job. Now, this is the only mention in all of the entire Bible where a woman is a shepherdess. Interesting, isn't it? I think this is just an indication that Rachel's a pretty special girl. And now I think Jacob's looking at her and he's saying the very same thing. This is a pretty special girl. Verse 10, and it came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Wow, like I said, take charge kind of guy, but why is he so motivated to move this stone and break from tradition? He's already been told by the other shepherds in the area, we don't do that. Why does he do this? Because I think it's like the guy, you ever notice when the bunch of guys are standing around, right, at the water cooler or whatever, and the pretty girl comes up, they stand like this, hi, you know, how you doing? And then the conversation changes to, yeah, I was at the gym yesterday and I went up 20 pounds on my benching and, you know, right? It's the posturing of men when women come and pose. And I think that's what Jacob's doing here. I get that impression. Jacob, he knows what he's there for. He's been sent to find a wife from among his own people, from among the people of faith. And here he is, and here's this beautiful woman, obviously a very very special girl, able to be a shepherdess, something a very difficult job, and he sees this, he knows what's going on. I think he's already got his eye on her. And I do think this is a biblical example of love at first sight. I really believe that. I really do. Now, verse 11, the very next thing, after he rolls the stone from the well so that the sheep of Laban, and let me tell you, I got to believe that at this point, Laban's sheep get water first. And they're just showing up. The other sheep been laying around for a while, right? But I just get this feeling Jacob took matters into his own hands. He's a take charge kind of guy. He knows what he wants what he knows, and he does what he does. And now verse 11, let's look. Then Jacob kissed Rachel, lifted up his voice, and wept. He is an emotional guy. Girls, you'd love him. He's sensitive. Sensitive guy. He would probably go to Anne Marie's Leah Sophia jewelry party with you. That's the kind of guy I think Jacob is. He's the kind of guy that us husbands, he makes us look bad. You ever notice these guys? I remember the last church I was in, I was up doing announcements, and there was a guy that was part of the church who would lead worship sometimes, and he had got up and done a special announcement for something else, and great guy, and some of you probably know what I'm talking about, but he was sharing how he and his wife had just gotten home from their, listen to this, 6-month anniversary getaway. 6-month anniversary getaway. And I got up there and I just looked at him and I shook my head. I said, man, you're making the rest of us look really bad. I just said 6-month anniversary getaway. I need notes from this guy. I'm like, and my wife was there. I said, shh, honey, don't listen to this. Now this kiss in verse 11 and this emotional outburst of Jacob. Remember now, give the guy a little credit. He's traveled between 500 and 600 miles to get here. And this is not a moment where he's sitting back and saying, he had his trust or his faith in his GPS or his map or the signs that he followed. He literally believes that God has led him to this very spot in this very moment. You see, for him, there's way too much coincidence. He knows that it's God who brought him to this place. And so he's having an emotional moment here. And he says, and he kisses Rachel. Now, I don't think this is like a passionate, romantic kiss. I really don't. But guys, you know what happens, right? Even a peck on the cheek to someone you're attracted to turns into something else in your heart. When your heart starts to beat real fast. I do believe that's what's going on here. And he's elated. Now, he lifted up his voice and wept. What do you suppose he said? Praise God. I do believe this is love at first sight. I think at this moment, in his mind, he's already thinking ahead of God. He's going, this is the one. This is it. This is the one God's chosen for me. And look at verse 12. Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's relative and that he was Rebekah's son. And so she ran and told her father. Sound familiar? The whole story is so familiar. Eleazar shows up with 10 camels at a well, looking for a 10-camel woman, you remember? Right? And Rebekah waters the 10 camels, and then he tells Rebekah the story. She runs to tell her father. It's like the identical thing happens again. Jacob shows up at a well. She tells Rachel the whole story. Rachel gets excited after being kissed on the cheek and runs back to tell her father, I'm telling my dad on you. No, it's not. I don't think it's that. I think it's, oh my goodness, there's a relative of ours from a far-off land. And she, I'm sure, had heard about her aunt Rebecca and that somebody came, this foreign, rich guy came and blessed us with all this wealth and took Rebecca to marry this prince down there in Canaan. And now here's a relative. And I wonder if maybe she dreamt about something like this happening someday. This romantic story where this man coming from far off with a great deal of wealth, a prince of his own people, coming to sweep her off her feet. And off she goes running to tell her father. Verse 13. Then it came to pass when Laban heard the report about Jacob his sister, that cash register sound started to ring in his head. You think that's what's going on? I do. So he, Laban, ran out to meet him and embraced and kissed him. and brought him into his house. And so he told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him for a month. Interesting. Stayed with him for a month. Now we've got to get our heads in this because, we go through verse by verse here, and it's like, here's a month passing in a few words. This is a month of him living at Laban's house, having journeyed for a month or more, okay? And now, so he's eating with the family. He's living in the family's tents or wherever they live. And he every day, he's looking at Rachel. Every day, he's noticing Rachel. And you got to believe Laban's clan, his family and his people, his peeps, are looking at him going, man, he's sweet on Rachel. And I'll bet you by this time they also notice she's got an eye on him as well. And I also think that because Laban benefited monetarily from Rebekah, that he's remembering that, and he has had a month now to scheme and to think how he's going to deal with this. Verse 15. Laban said to Jacob, because you're my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what should your wages be? This is a conniver's way of negotiating. In other words, what he's really saying here is, by the way, you're going to serve me. Now let's enter into a negotiation about how little you're going to make. That's what he's saying. Should you serve me for nothing? No, I'll pay you something. But how much you think you're worth, right? Is what he's saying. And so, Laban's negotiating technique is to assume a position that he's got Jacob's best interests at heart. It's very manipulative. That's funny too, because right now we're in the process, Christina and I need to replace our second car, the car that typically she drives every day. And so I'm driving all over the state of New Jersey looking at cars. I'm on the internet looking for things that we think are going to fit really what it is that we need and all that stuff. And yesterday I found myself, you guys are going to think I'm crazy, but I found myself in Passaic. Who knows where Passaic is? Oh my goodness. I heard this is the look I'm getting. Oh yeah, I know where Passaic is. It's not a bad place. It's in this little car dealership right on the side of the river, and you might think, oh, that's pretty. Not so pretty. And the cars, they look so good on the ads and the internet, don't they, the photographs? And it's like, wow, that looks nice. And you get there and you're like, oh my goodness. And this one car, it's like, I asked the guy, I said, do you have one of those Carfax vehicle history reports so I could know if the car's ever been in an accident or not? He goes, oh no, we don't do that here. I go, some of the other dealerships do that. You guys don't do that? You should do that. And he goes, nah, we don't have availability of that. And I said, and then he goes, so what do you think? He goes, you drove it. It drove nice. I said, it drove nice, but I think it's been in an accident, and I won't do anything unless I see some kind of vehicle history report, so I know whether something's been reported. And he goes, wait a minute, let me see what I could do. He comes back out with a 5-page vehicle history report. I felt like saying, listen, Laban, I got to go. I really don't have any more time for you. But he brought it out there. Sure enough, there were 2 accidents in the vehicle history report. And I looked as the engine was running, and the pulleys with the belt that go around and all. There was the lowest one, which is the one that sort of lines up with you gearheads with the crankshaft. That's like the lowest pulley, And I watched as it was wobbling. I'm like, that's not good. And then I saw as there's this shaft. You know how you turn your steering wheel where there's a shaft under your hood that connects to a gearbox, and that's turns your rack and your all your gears and makes your wheels steer. Well, I noticed that shaft was rubbing against the fender. I'm like, that's not good either. And then I saw, I looked underneath and I saw this, oil on the bottom of the oil pan. I'm like, and that's not good either. But the price is great. I'm like, well, yeah, the price is great. This is Laban, just so you know. We joke about used car salesmen. And what's funny is you go into the dealerships now, and they're all saying the same thing. There are some good ones out there. There's some good, this is their line now. It's just not worth it to cheat anybody anymore. We just, we sell them for what they're worth, and we just go and we buy whatever we can buy, and we just sell them for whatever they're worth. It's just not worth it for us. The old days, those are the old days when guys used to do those kinds of things. We don't do that anymore. They still do that. Don't believe that. No matter how much you want to believe them. And guess what? That's the situation here. Jacob wants to believe everything Laban says. He's vulnerable because he has got his heart beating out of his chest for a beautiful young Rachel. Jacob was accustomed to a wealthy family, and it's not likely that he's all that familiar with what it means to be a servant, Jacob. And now Laban is going to make him a servant in his house. And you know, it's been well said, and I don't know if you ever heard this before, is that you don't know what kind of servant you are until you're treated like one. Anyone ever treated you like a servant? Did it offend you? You know, when I got to Bible college, the very first thing that they taught us about being in ministry, because, you know, not everybody that goes to Bible college, by the way, is there to go into ministry. And I want to encourage you young people that, you know, if you lack direction, if you're struggling with what to do with your life, you ought to go to Bible college. Whether or not you think you're going to go to ministry full time, you might want to be, you know, who knows, you might want to be a used car salesman. That's great. Be a Christian used car salesman. Be one of the few honest ones out there. That'd be awesome. I wouldn't mind owning myself a little car lot. You know, I could go buy wholesale vehicles from D. Felice Chevrolet, bring them in there and sell them. It'd be great. And I could do it honestly. But when I was out there at Bible college, one of the first things, because I felt I had a calling to be a pastor, and one of the first things they taught us was, you know what? The number one characteristic, the number one quality in someone who God is calling to be a pastor is servanthood. You first have to be a servant. If you're not a servant, you might as well forget being in ministry. Servanthood is the number one qualification of ministry. And I said, all right, well, let me, you know, am I a servant? I started to ask myself that, am I a servant? Well, so people have always told me I've had the gift of servanthood. You know, like I see a need and I just jump right on it. But how you really know is when people treat you like a servant. When you show up and you're doing, you know, let's say you show up at the church and, you know, early and you're the one, you know, scrubbing the toilets or mopping the floors and you know you're there doing that, and somebody comes in and they don't give you the time of day, they walk right past you and you know, they ask someone who's only been to the church a few times, you know, something that you ought to be the one to tell them, or you know, you just get treated poorly because, you know, you're serving. How does that make you feel? Should make you feel like Jesus, because that's how he intended to feel, like a servant. And we all ought to have that mindset that we want to be like Christ and that we're a servant. And now, one of the things that Jacob has to learn is what it means to be a servant. You can't have servants unless you know how to be a servant, I think. And so, you know, Laban, here's this negotiation. Tell me what your wages should be. And now verse 16, Jacob's like, what should my wages be? I'm going to serve this man. What should my wages be? And so in verse 16, you know, he had two daughters, not just the one, and the name of the elder one was Leah, and the name of the younger one was Rachel. Now this verse 17 is very difficult. We don't really know what it meant, but it says that Leah, the older daughter's eyes were delicate. But Rachel, and this gives us a little clue, but Rachel, because it gives us it's a contrast. Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. And so they speculate as to what this meant. No one really knows, and there's just a bunch of conjecture, but they say that, you know, the eyes, you know, they were a very attractive part of a woman back then. And I got to admit, that's something that gets me. When I look into a woman's eyes, if they're beautiful eyes, that really gets me. You know, I look at my wife's eyes. It's not just the color, by the way. It's something in the eyes, you know, and I understand that. And I think that's sort of along the lines of something that's going on here. So it could be that she just, you know, Maybe she was squinty. I don't know, something like this. Or, you know, they were weak, or they were delicate, or they weren't as attractive, or I really don't know what it was. Just that we could tell from verse 17 that Rachel was absolutely above average beautiful. And I just think, you know, Leah was probably just average in terms of, you know, beauty. And they say, you know, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, there's something about this, you know, verse 17 that seems to indicate that as far as Jacob was concerned, he found Rachel to be beautiful and not Leah. And now Jacob loved Rachel. Keep in mind, there's over a month has passed at this point. And he has absolutely fallen in love with Rachel. And I often like to tell people, before you make any decisions, because people will come to me as a pastor and they'll say, I think this is the one for me, and so on and so forth. I usually tell people, you know what? 4 months is a good amount of time to wait, where you're really interacting and going through counseling, and 4, maybe 5 months is minimum before you commit to anything and start planning anything. Because after a while, that whole initial excitement and that heart thumping, it seems to calm down right around that 4-month period. And you seem to be able to see more clearly. And so I try to tell people, you know what? You ought to be in counseling. You ought to be working to get, 4 months. You ought to be, really considering and being willing to allow the Lord to challenge your heart. Now, I think that this is a relationship that God is blessing. And so, he's got his eye on Rachel. We've learned about the older sister now. And Jacob loved Rachel. He fell in love with her. And so he says to Laban, you know what? I'll serve you 7 years. I'll stay and serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. Now, can that be any more specific, you guys? Her name is Rachel. She's the younger one. Can that be any more specific? No, I don't think it can be. And we're going to see that Laban doesn't care about that. And yet here he's willing to give 7 years of his life in service for her. And Laban's response is this: it is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to another man. Stay with me. And so we have an accord, right? We have a deal. You stay with me 7 years and she'll be yours. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of the love he had for her. Wow. So husbands, do you think you would work 7 years for your brides? Go back to when you first met them. It seems like that, right? You're just like, you're waiting in anticipation, and it's building and building and building and building and building. But 7 years. Now, you got to remember, the average lifespan back then was a lot more. So I don't know, what is this more like? Maybe 7 months? My wife and I, we were married to the day 4 months after we met. We met, and 4 months later, we were standing before the Lord getting married. That's how convinced we were that God had chosen us for each other. But you got to keep in mind that entire 4 months we lived on the same Bible college campus. And so we spent so much time together every single day that the relationship was in a bit of an incubator. And so everything was on fast pace. And we know that, God chose us to be together. There was a lot of these moments where we traveled, it seemed like we traveled 500 miles and just found the right place at the right time, and God brought us together. And that's what Jacob sees in Rachel, is that God had brought them together, and he's willing to serve 7 years. And he's falling deeper and deeper in love with her every single day. And 7 years seemed like a few days. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled that I may go in to her." It's like, hey man, remember 7 years ago the deal we made? Come on. Verse 22. Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. And now it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, his daughter, and brought her to Jacob, and he went in to her. And Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. So it came to pass in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, "What is this thing you've done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why have you deceived me?" Aw, poor Jacob. Do you feel bad for him? Somebody said no. Well, I kind of do, but you got to remember, this is the exact same thing he did to his father. You remember? He dressed just like his brother. He disguised his skin to be just like his brother. He wore his brother's scent from wearing his dirty clothes. His mother was complicit in scheming against his father to trick him in making the stew that his brother made, making someone out to be someone else. I wonder if Laban took some of Rachel's clothing and put it on Leah. And then I wonder, how dark was it? out there in the desert. Or maybe I wondered, what was it that they served to drink at the feast? How could this be? Nonetheless, we know it was to be, and I'm sure we can imagine now, he probably drank some wine, and I'm sure that's part of the problem here, although we're not told in the story. But nonetheless, this is what happens, and it happens just the way he did it to his own father. And verse 26. This is Laban's answer. It must not be done so in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Older, younger, sounds familiar, right? Older, younger, older first, younger second. Interesting. Jacob having to be told this. And I wonder what's going on in Jacob's mind as all this is going on. He's like, wow, this is exactly what I did. And probably why we see the way he handles this as we get into this a little further. I don't know how much further I'm going to get, actually. Let's see. Jacob says to Laban, what have you done to me? And Laban says, it must not be done. The older must go first. And if this was the custom, I'm wondering if Jacob even said this. You know what? If this was the custom here, why didn't you tell me this 7 years ago when I made you this deal? And so Laban says, fulfill her week, and we will give you this one also for the service which you will serve with me. Still another 7 years. We're going to end there. No, we'll end at 29. How's that sound? You guys all right with that? 29, because that's when it begins, the section where children begin to be born. So Jacob did fulfill her week, and so he gave him a daughter, Rachel also his wife. And now it's interesting here. I want you to take note of this. Jacob does not try to give Leah back. Say, she's not mine. Could it be that because of the conviction he's receiving as a result of what he sees that's being done to him, the same that he's done to his father, that he's trying to figure out what's right and wrong here? Maybe he's learning integrity. That's a good question. And then Laban, it says in verse 29, gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as a maid. So then Jacob also went into Rachel, and he also loved Rachel, notice this, more than Leah. And he served with Laban still another 7 years. Now he gets Rachel to be his wife earlier than the end of the 7 years, so he didn't have to wait. But wait till you see as we go forward what polygamy does in a family, the problems that he has to face. Not only is it a problem that he's now married to two sisters, but their maids even get in the act here, and they have children through maids. And guys, you know what? This is the children, this is Israel being formed right now. Jacob's name is later changed to Israel, which literally meant governed by God. This is a nation forming out of 12 tribes before our eyes in a polygamous situation. And keep in mind also as you read ahead this week, Jacob is around 80 years old here, and the next 50 years of his life as we go forward are going to be very, very hard because of this. Let's all stand.